we're ready to start. My name is Luis Damert. I am the Latin America Director for the Natural Resource Governance Institute in RGI. And this is the fourth iteration of a series of webinars we are holding on strategic minerals, supply chains, and governance challenges in the Andes. This is a series that has been in Spanish. This is the first and only time we're going to be doing it in English. This is a project funded by the GIZ, the German Corporation, and as I said, this is the fourth series. The first one was an overview on the issue of critical minerals in the Andes. The second one made a reflection on the governance challenges associated to this new issue. The third session was focused on the challenges for transparency across the supply chain. And this session, we are focusing on the global supply chain for electric vehicles, batteries, and the governance implications for this. Just wanted to thank you for coming. I want to remind you that this is the last session of the year. Next year, we're having case studies, one about lithium in Chile and Bolivia, one about copper in Peru, and one about coal in Colombia. And then we are going to have a final session in which we discuss the civil society's governance agenda around critical minerals in the Andes. Okay, so I just wanted to thank you for coming. With no further ado, I will hand it to my colleague, Margarita Batle, who will facilitate this webinar. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. As Juan Luis said, thanks for coming. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Margarita Batle. I work at the Natural Resource Governance Institute, NRGI. I'm based in London. So what I will do first is provide some housekeeping clarifications. Basically, this session, as you might have already seen, will be recorded. Then you will be able to access it on our website, but it'll also be shared with you. This will be a 90-minute session. We will first have a presentation, then some comments from our guests, and after that, a Q&A. Time for you to raise any questions you might have or engage in discussion. So please, if you have any questions during the presentation or at any point, drop them on the Q&A box. Just to say that if you feel more comfortable asking those questions in Spanish, that's totally okay. We'll be able to translate them or just post them as they are and will be answered by our guests. Well, as we were saying, today's topic will be presented by Patrick Heller, and then we will have comments from Emily Hirsch and Victor Andrés Garzón. So I'm going to take some time to introduce them all so that we can then start with our session. Patrick works as an advisor at NRGI. He has worked on legal reform and governance initiatives in the developing world for more than 20 years for organizations including USAID, the US State Department, the Asian Development Bank, Creative Associates International, and the International Center for Transitional Justice. He's a senior visiting fellow at the Center for Law, Energy, and Environment at the University of California, Berkeley. Patrick's work at NRGI focuses on several core elements of natural resource governance, including the management of state-owned enterprises, legislative and regulatory reform, and oil and mining contracts. He coordinates the organization's emerging work on the implications of climate change for the economies of resource-dependent countries. He contributes extensively to NRGI's programs of technical assistance to governments and civil society organizations throughout the world, and to NRGI's capacity development efforts. He has facilitated courses on oil, gas, and mining legal frameworks with partner institutions, including the University of Oxford, Columbia University, Gadjah Mada University in Indonesia, the Catholic University of Central Africa, Cameroon, and the Universidad Externado de Colombia in Bogotá. He holds a law degree from Stanford University and a master's in international relations from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Thanks so much, Patrick, for joining us. Then, as we already explained, we will have time for some comments from two other experts. First, Emily Hirsch. Emily is a managing partner at TCDB Group. She's a well-known expert in the lithium and battery industry. She's the host of the Minerals Manhattan Project podcast and the weekly Recharge video series. In addition, she manages projects in South America for companies in the mining, energy, oil, and gas industries. Her lithium expertise includes project due diligence, country risk assessment, and emerging battery technologies. Emily has given keynote speeches on lithium, energy storage, renewable energy in Latin America, and emerging battery technology at events organized by different institutions. In 2018, Emily founded AMES Argentina, the Association of Women in Energy and Sustainability in Argentina. She's a member of the International Kappa Kappa Gamma Brotherhood and the Electrochemical Society. Emily has a Bachelor of Science in Economics from Tulane University, a Master's in International Affairs from American University, and has done graduate course in renewable energy at the Instituto Tecnológico de Buenos Aires, IRBA. Lastly, our other expert that will be commenting after Patrick's presentation is Víctor Andrés Garzón. Victor is a mining and metallurgy engineer from the National University of Colombia. He holds a master's degree in metallurgy from the Universidad Católica del Norte in Chile. Since 2013, he has worked on issues of governance of natural resources, specifically transparency, public-private partnerships, taxation, and economic linkages. Their interest is to analyze and propose the best ways in which an adequate management of mineral resources can be translated into long-term development for the host countries and territories. From his work with the German cooperation, he has supported processes of governmental institutions, civil society organizations, and multi-stakeholder groups in the Andean region, as well as multilateral institutions. Previously, he worked in the private sector as an operations and planning engineer, as well as a research and development engineer in underground gold and copper mines in Chile and Colombia. Currently, he focuses on transparency and mining taxation issues and the implications of the energy transition for the mining sector. Thank you all for joining us again. We're really glad to have you here as part of this series, as Juan Luis was explaining before. So basically, to go directly to the presentation, I will just share with you some points about Patrick's presentation, and then I can give him the floor to really start, to really kick things off. So Patrick Heller's presentation will focus on how the mineral inputs into electric vehicle batteries fit into the global push to increase the penetration of electromobility. He will examine the particular structure of the supply chains for key battery minerals and the impact of that structure on the opportunities and risks surrounding governance in the mineral producing countries. He will also examine the set of international initiatives that is emerging around battery supply chain sustainability, in order to brainstorm on the impact that these efforts can have on governance in the region. Thank you, everyone. Now I'm going to give Patrick the floor. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Margarita, and thanks to all of you for being here with us. And let me begin by apologizing by saying that I think it's because of me that this session is in English and not Spanish. So thank you for your patience. I know this is a disruption to what the normal course of the series has been. You don't want to hear me try and struggle through doing the presentation in Spanish, so I appreciate your patience. And as Margarita said, what I'm going to try and focus on in my remarks and I hope it will be building on what you've been doing up till now in the series, is starting to look at what the characteristics of the international supply chain for electric vehicle batteries are as they've been developing, and what the implications of those characteristics might be for governance questions that you're facing in your work as civil society activists in the region. I want to start by saying that this is a work in progress, and we in NRGI, in partnership with my colleagues at UC Berkeley, have been over the course of the last year or so doing some research, and in a minute I'll show you the reports that we've come out with, doing some research funded by the Climate Works Foundation on what the electric vehicle supply chain looks like, where the major points of friction and challenge are in the supply chain, and what that means for how we think about the sustainability of the electric vehicle industry, but also sustainability in the mineral producing countries themselves. And why I say it's a work in progress is, we spent the better part of a year trying to understand and start to unpack pieces of that international picture. And what we're doing now, in consultation with several of you on the call and other experts worldwide, is to start to think about, okay, if we're looking at questions of governance in the mineral producing country, what do the traits of the international marketplace mean? And how does that change our agenda as governance activists and governance advocates? And so what I'm going to present to you today is a work in progress version of what we're starting to think about in terms of, okay, how does the international structure impact on what all of you are doing within the countries where you're working? And so I'd encourage I'm so grateful to have Emily and Victor Andres here today. Their expertise surpasses mine on so many of these issues, and I'll look forward to their feedback on some of the thoughts that I'm putting out there, but also to all of you who are participants in the call, because what we're trying to do here is a brainstorming process, right? And I'm going to put some ideas out there on, okay, what does this international structure mean for the work that you're all doing in the region? But we all need to be learning together in all of this, and so I'll look forward to your feedback. I'm going to put a slide deck up. Okay, Margarita, can you just confirm, do you see it? And is my face still visible somewhere on your screen?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. So these are the two reports. I presume we'll circulate these materials, but these are the two pieces that we came out with over the course of this year. And really they are I would say, primers on what we've learned through the consultations that we've been doing. So we, NRGI and Berkeley Law, have been consulting with industry representatives from mineral companies, battery companies, electric vehicle companies, with civil society activists, both globally and within the producer countries, including some of you on the call today, with international initiatives, with bilateral and multilateral donors, to try and unpack the ways in which the structure of the supply chain are relevant for governance choices and the sustainability of mining within the producer countries. And as I say, the goal is really in both directions, right? The goal is to share some recommendations on how international supply chain efforts, and we'll spend some time talking about them, can improve so as to be more relevant to the core governance challenges in producer countries, but also in the other direction as well, how those who are seeking to influence policy and governance within the producer countries can take advantage of and can better understand what's happening at the international level. So that's what I'll spend the next 30 minutes or so sharing with you today. I'm going to do three things, which you see on your outline here. I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of how electric vehicle markets are evolving and some of the core mineral inputs that are necessary for an increase in the uptake of electric vehicles in the global marketplace. A lot of this will probably be familiar to many of you, but I think it's helpful as a way to kind of put the discussion into context. Second, I'll talk about the structure of the supply chain and as I said, share some initial brainstorming on how core elements of that supply chain structure and the way in which these markets function impact producer countries. And then finally, I'll talk about international clean battery initiatives. As you'll see, there is a proliferation of initiatives that are trying to promote sustainability in the electric vehicle battery space. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the leading ones, but also some overarching observations about the way these initiatives are functioning and ways in which they can be improved. I've asked Margarita to cut me off if it looks like I'm going over time, because I want to make sure that we have lots of time for discussion. You'll see I have my stopwatch with me here as well. So let's start by talking about the evolution of electric vehicle markets and their mineral inputs. I think the core is this, right? In order to achieve global climate goals, a significant transition from internal combustion engine vehicles to electric vehicles is a core part of the picture. And I think that's the place that we need to start this discussion, is by situating what's happening within the mineral producing countries, within this global drive and the absolute critical nature of a shift towards electromobility. A couple of stats here, just to kind of situate things. So on the left-hand side of your screen here, you'll see the contributions to carbon emissions by sector in the IEA's most recent data. About 26% of all global emissions are coming from transportation. The vast majority of that, around 72%, which you see on the right-hand side of your screen here, is coming from road emissions, right? Cars, trucks, etc. And most importantly, for our purposes, the growth in emissions from the transport sector since 1970 has overwhelmingly come from road transport. So about 80% of all of the growth in transport emissions has come from road vehicles. If the core point here is, if we want to tackle global emissions in pursuit of the fight against global warming, a significant shift away from internal combustion vehicles towards electric vehicles is absolutely critical. This is a big piece of that. So we get the question a lot when we talk about this work, well, is it really true that today electric vehicles really are cleaner than internal combustion vehicles? This is a point that the fossil fuel industry continually likes to push, and saying, okay, if you look at the overall life cycle emissions of electric vehicles, are they actually significantly cleaner from a climate perspective? And the answer to that question is yes, they are already, and that the gap is getting larger. What you see on your screen here is a graphic from a research organization called Transport and the Environment, which shows the advantages of electric vehicles as compared to internal combustion fossil fuel fired vehicles in Europe. Now, the variance that you see from one country to another here relates primarily to how clean the energy source is, how clean the electricity sources are in different countries, right? Charging an electric vehicle requires linking into the electrical grid of the country that the consumer is in. So the cleaner the energy sources are, the electricity sources are in the producer countries, the greater are the climate advantages of using an electric vehicle as compared to using an internal combustion engine vehicle. So you'll see that already in Europe, quite significant advantages. And if you look at the orange bar on your screen here, you'll see that across the board, it's projected that as the electrical grids get cleaner and cleaner in these countries, the advantages of electric vehicles will get greater and greater. Now, there's always the elephant in the room here, which is China. where we've seen some of the greatest growth in electric vehicle uptake in the world. Even today in China, and where energy generation tends to be less carbon friendly in China, less climate friendly in China than is the case in Europe. Already today, most estimates have electric vehicles that are used in China at somewhere between 10 and 20% cleaner than internal combustion engine vehicles. And again, those advantages are likely to grow over time. So first starting point is electric vehicles significantly better from a climate perspective than internal combustion vehicles, and those advantages are likely to continue to grow over time. What you see here is reflective of a reality that there's been tremendous growth in purchases of electric vehicles across the world over the course of the last decade, driven very heavily by new purchases within China, but also within Europe and to a lesser degree in the US as well. So we're seeing really significant growth in the stock, but the reality is we are still nowhere near the uptake of electric vehicles that we need in order to achieve the Paris climate goals or any significant alleviation of climate change. What you see on the right-hand side of your screen here is the International Energy Agency's estimates of how much we would need electric vehicles to grow, the electric vehicle market to grow, if we are to meet the Paris goals. So if on the left-hand side of your screen, 2019 looks pretty big, but if you look on the right-hand side, we're still scratching the surface of what the world needs if it's going to achieve climate sustainability. So huge growth necessary in the coming decade. Now, there's been some progress in that shift away from internal combustion vehicles, and I think there's the promise of more progress. Part of that comes from technological advances and reductions in the cost of building electric vehicles, which makes them more affordable to consumers, extensions in battery life, other technological changes. Part of it is policy as well. So we're seeing a growing number of governments committing to either banning the sale of internal combustion engine vehicles outright, including here in my state of California where I live, and other governments which aren't going so far as to take an outright ban, but which are putting in place strong incentives to encourage consumers to purchase electric vehicles and otherwise promote their growth. What I'm showing you on the slide now is a map created by a think tank that's looking at where countries have already undertaken policy commitments. I won't go into the details now, but as you see, sort of dominated by Europe, with less progress so far in Asia and in the US. All of these slides have hyperlinks to the sources, so I'd encourage all of you to go take a look if you're interested in diving in more detail. So, as we all know, expanding the EV market in this way means significantly expanding mineral production. Now, here's where I reissue my caveat. I am not a chemist. I am not an engineer. Emily and Victor Andres will know a lot more than me about the chemical compositions of the components of electric vehicle batteries. What I want to note here is that there are a number of different technologies that are evolving, a lot of different kinds of compounds that go into the production of different kinds of electric vehicle batteries. All of them are very mineral intensive. Lithium is an important part of virtually all of them, but depending on which sort of technology a company uses and their advantages and disadvantages of each of these different technologies, the breakdown of different kinds of mineral inputs in them will vary. But the kind of growth we need requires significant growth in production of most of these minerals, no matter how you cut it. Here are a couple of different, I'm not going to go into detail about the specifics of all of these scenarios, but what I want to show here are a couple of examples from different kinds of market analyses of the growth that would be necessary in production of lithium and cobalt, which are the two most prominent examples. What we're looking at are, estimates vary, but what we're looking at, according to most analysts, are growth in the demands for these minerals anywhere between 200 up to 500% over the course of the next 10 plus years. So huge increases necessary under most of the scenarios that analysts of the market have been putting out there. Now, within that, it's difficult to project the precise amount of growth, and there's a lot of variability in the marketplace. And that's, I'll come back to it in a little bit, but that's one of the factors that is particularly challenging for countries that are trying to continue to develop and enhance and make more sustainable their mineral production. We know that significant growth will be necessary, but it is hard to predict exactly what that will look like for the reasons that you see on the slide here. Overall, growth in electric vehicles depends upon the overall health of the global economy. We're witnessing the spillover effects of global economic shocks right now, obviously with the pandemic. The policy commitments on electric vehicles is unstable and unpredictable. And speaking from the United States, I can assure you, or you don't need me to say that U.S. policy around climate change has been unstable and remains somewhat unpredictable depending on electoral results and other forces here in the U.S. There is rapid technological change in the technologies that form batteries, and there's constantly research going on among cathode manufacturers, battery manufacturers, and electric vehicle companies, constantly trying to improve and adapt the way in which they develop the technologies that go into this. And that means that knowing exactly which minerals will be most in demand can be challenging and can be difficult. In particular, and I'll come back to this in a little bit, the supply chain challenges related to cobalt are prompting a lot of research in the industry on how to make batteries that use less cobalt. And to the degree that that research is successful, that will have spillover effects into other minerals as well. And then the last factor here is there's uncertainty around the pace of uptake of battery recycling. So if batteries are significantly recycled and can be put back into the marketplace, that will at the margins impact how much mineral demand is necessary to build new batteries. There are big pushes in some quarters to increase significantly electric vehicle recycling. I would say there hasn't been a tremendous amount of progress yet in implementation of these recycling programs. And so there's a lot of uncertainty over what will happen in the next 10 or 20 years and what impact that will have on the growth of mineral markets. So that's a little bit of an overview of where the pieces fit together in this sort of battery electric vehicle nexus. Now I'm going to get into the structure of the supply chain and its impacts on the producer countries. Again, some hypotheses on impacts on the producer countries. And I want to start here by flagging something that Juan Luis and I have talked about a lot, and that I know is an issue that several of you are facing as you think about the evolution of your advocacy around mineral sector governance in strategic minerals within Latin American countries. And that's to say this, you hear a lot of different terms used, right? Critical minerals, strategic minerals, green technology minerals. And what I want to focus on is that typically when we hear the term strategic mineral, that is used to refer to, that is a term that refers to the perspective of the producer country, right? So mineral is strategic to the economy of your country if it is a core pillar upon which the economy depends, if it has particular implications for national security, etc. Typically, the term critical mineral is defined from the perspective of the consumer country. Minerals that are necessary for the growth of certain industries and in which there are risks that supply may be challenged. And therefore, the consumer countries are trying to develop policies to kind of emphasize or shore up their supply. But I like to talk, or we're increasingly in NRGI talking about major versus minor metals. Now, major metals include things like copper, bauxite, iron ore, and what's particular about them or what's generalizable about them are they have a wide range of uses. So they're not, even though an electric vehicle uses significantly more copper than an internal combustion engine vehicle does, electromobility is a relatively small share of global copper markets, right? Copper is integrated across a wide range of uses. The markets for these minerals are mature, meaning they are commodities. There is a relatively transparent way to sort of see what the value of them are on global exchanges where they tend to be traded. Supply of these metals is relatively abundant, and usually most of them have a wide range of sources, so they're produced in lots of different places, and they can typically be transported and stored easily. Now, if we talk about minor or more specialized metals, cobalt, lithium, other kind of clean energy metals that go into a lot of these technologies, I think it's important to emphasize that in some ways the markets for these minor metals are much more specialized, and Emily and Victor Andres can provide more input into this, but their use is much more limited to certain dominant outputs, and the way in which the minerals are extracted and processed means their chemical composition tends to be tailored, right? So a particular grade or composition of cobalt can be used for a particular type of battery. And there are generally a smaller number of players in the marketplace here, which means that those two factors together means that they are not just traded on global exchanges in the same way that the major metals are. And then the last factor here is that for a lot of these metals, transport and storage can be particularly challenging. And I'm going to come to what some of the implications of that are. So the reason I like to bring this up is these distinctions really matter. And when I'm talking about kind of the impact of the market structure here, I'm talking primarily, and some of the brainstorming that we've started to do is thinking primarily about what is it that is particular about the marketplaces for some of these more specialized materials, and what does that mean for governance and the way that you're thinking about managing them. So what you see here is a very simplified depiction of the supply chain structure, and I've highlighted cobalt and lithium here in part for some of the reasons that I cited before. And there are a couple of things that I want to focus on, and I'm going to come back to them throughout this next section of the presentation. One is that from the raw material stage through the refining stage, and then into the manufacturing of battery cathodes and anodes, the inclusion of those in cells and battery packs, and then into the vehicle manufacturing stage, there are a number of bottlenecks. And what I mean by that is there's a pretty small number of players, and the industry kind of goes through those players. That matters a lot, and or at least I hypothesize that matters a lot for countries that are thinking about how to manage their mineral outputs in a sustainable way. Some of the factors here that matter. So there are bottlenecks in the supply chain, as I say, a concentrated number of players. And what I want to highlight here in the graphic that you see is a huge share of this market passes through East Asia, but in particular passes through China. And as you see here, the midstream, so the refining of the chemicals, the manufacturing of cathodes and anodes, and the creation of battery cells, that is really dominated by Chinese companies, and a lot of that takes place within China itself. Huge implications, and I'll come to some of that for kind of what the options and what the needs are for the producer countries. Second, as I mentioned, the mineral outputs are highly linked to specific uses. So you can't just, you have to develop the lithium that you develop and sell, the particular chemical composition of it can be used for certain outputs, can't be traded in the same way as copper would be on a global exchange. And again, Emily has so much expertise on this. I hope she can help elaborate and clarify on this point as well. The prices, because there isn't this sort of trading in international marketplaces in the same way, international price mechanisms are not as well developed. You're starting to see some global listed prices for certain kinds of cobalt and lithium contracts, but it's not the case that, as you can do for aluminum or copper or iron ore, you can say, okay, it's very clear what the particular value of my output is. And as I mentioned, a lot of the value is lost in transportation and storage. So these can't be just sort of stored or warehoused indefinitely. The link between the mineral output and all of the stages that come next have to be fairly tight. So what does that mean for governance in the producer countries? One is that monitoring the sector and regulating what the value of it is can be a real challenge. So getting a good deal out of this sector, knowing what the country's output is worth, is less transparent than is the case for the major metals. Planning can be unpredictable because of all of the things that I've mentioned, right? It's harder to know, there's more factors determining where the market is going. And therefore it is even harder than is the case for more traditional metals to understand and to plan around, okay, what's the value of this going to be? What does the marketplace look like? The contractual relationships carry particular weight over the long term because production at the mine site is so closely tied to what is happening up the supply chain. The geopolitics in all of this matters a lot, and you know the desire of Western governance to reduce the dominance of China in the marketplace means the mineral producing countries are getting fierce and intense lobbying from all sides to tie up supply in particular ways. And I want to note that value addition, because things are so specialized, because transportation and storage can cause problems, because there is the real energy intensity of production, it is more difficult to add value in a lot of ways in for some of these specialized minerals than is the case for more traditional minerals. I'm just looking at the time, and I'm going to go through the rest relatively rapidly to make sure we have time. The next factor is that the industry is really in flux, as I've said, and in particular, we've seen big assets changing hands, particularly in cobalt. So one of the biggest cobalt mines in the world, the international mining company that Freeport-McMoRan, which was the sort of holder of a large share of the assets, recently sold its stake in that cobalt mine. There are prospects of other assets changing hands among players in the space at potentially a rapid pace. And the transparency both around these transfers and, to be honest, around the contracts that are governing these sales remains really limited. In preparation for this session, we have a database, resourcecontracts.org, where we post as many publicly available mineral contracts as we can. I looked up what lithium contracts are publicly available and captured in that database. I found 3 worldwide. Now, we may be missing some, but the reality is that contracts for a lot of these minerals tend to be still very opaque. The implications of this flux are there's a risk of real significant swings. And so as governments are planning around how to get value out of this sector, it is really difficult to plan with any certainty. And then transparency and guarding against conflict of interest are particularly important here. The final sort of market factor that I want to focus on is that large reserves of these minerals tend to be or have a heavy share in fragile developing and emerging economies. So the graph you see here are reserves. The circles are the size of reserves, and the sort of darkness of the red is the fragile states index that shows the kind of state of political governance and fragility in the producer countries. The one that is most important to highlight here is that cobalt and the Democratic Republic of Congo play a really outsized role in the global discourse around battery minerals. Congo control, or 60% of global production comes out of the DRC. A significant share of this production is from artisanal production, and that's where you see a lot of the risks of environmental damage, harm to workers, child labor, that tend to kind of dominate the discourse around battery minerals. There have been major corruption scandals in the industrial mining sector in the Congo as well. And there is a long history of minerals being a part of long-standing conflict in the country. And the reason I bring this up connects to what we're going to talk about next, that when you hear people in international debates talk about battery minerals, a lot of the specific concerns that people are talking about tend to really be dominated by these very significant, very real concerns around cobalt in the DRC. So in the few minutes I have left, I'm going to provide a quick overview of what we've seen when it comes to some of these international clean battery initiatives, and to talk about what they might mean for governance in the region in which you all are working. And one of the things that I like to emphasize on this topic is I think there is a real opportunity and maybe some risk in connecting all of our work around governance into the global narrative around clean energy. I think the opportunity is there is a real drive to, and including real consumer interest in promoting greater electric mobility to tackle the global climate crisis. And consumers are increasingly paying attention to the supply chain that is generating electric vehicle batteries. And I think that generates for us as global governance activists, and as activists within particular countries, I think there's a way to capitalize on that to help in the push for meaningful reform and long-term sustainability, both in the kind of specialized minerals and metals, lithium, cobalt, etc., but also even as they connect to traditional minerals and metals where there are kind of long-standing governance deficits that we can help use to encourage reform. There's a piece of this that I think we all have to kind of be conscious of and to think about as we continue to engage in our work, which is fossil fuel interests are very enthusiastic about using the very real challenges related to battery materials as a way to kind of fuel propaganda campaigns to say, the shift away from fossil fuels is really not that important because look how bad things are on the battery front. And I think it's important, I don't have the answer, but I think it's important for all of us in the work that we're doing to kind of remember and to be reminding people that governance of fossil fuels is no better and in some senses is worse, and to think about the way that our advocacy around minerals connects to the need for global environmental shifts. I'm not, just as a function of time, I'm not going to go into detail about all of these international initiatives. I've put a bunch up on the screen here. Really, I could have had 50 logos on here because there are a huge and growing number of international initiatives that are promoting greater sustainability in the battery supply chain, and these initiatives are, many of them, very serious. They come with a lot of thought and interest aligned with them. It's possible to do a little bit of categorizing, and what we want to do, we've created this taxonomy, but we need to still fill it in sort of helping people look at, okay, how do these different initiatives map on, right? Some are tackling human rights only, others are tackling labor issues. Others are tackling environmental and economic justice. They come from a wide range of participants. Some are strictly government-focused initiatives. Others are, industry-dominated. And they work in a lot of different ways, right? So some of them are binding legal constraints. Others are kind of consumer-facing certification schemes. Others exist more as a way to kind of share information and inform practice as it evolves. But what I want to focus on, and our report shares some more detail on this, as you all as Latin American activists are thinking about these initiatives and what they might mean for the work that you're doing, I wanted to flag a few of these overarching observations. One is that it's become really clear that there are a lot of initiatives. I don't think there's a need for more initiatives, but there's definitely a need for better coordination among the initiatives. And that connects to the second point that on the slide here, which is that what we've seen across the board from activists we've talked to, from companies and from governments, is it's really a challenge to figure out, okay, where do I invest my resources? I'm getting calls from 10 different initiatives, and I don't have the time to figure out where do I actually invest and where do we really make a push. That connects to the third thing that you see here, which is that many of these initiatives have a lot of thought has gone into them, but enforcement and sanction has been really weak, and there's a need for them to develop kind of greater teeth. Fourth, most of these discussions are dominated by things that are going on in Brussels, in Washington, in Paris, and there hasn't been enough investment in many of these cases to discussions that are happening with stakeholders on the ground, including some of the stakeholders that you are all working with very heavily in your work. Fifth, we tend to see still real silos between those who are working on human rights, those who are working on environmental justice, and those who are working on governance and transparency. And obviously we in NRGI believe all of these things are very closely interconnected, and there's a need to break down the silos. And then finally, and I think important for an opportunity that activists in Latin America have, the drivers, when you look at the content of many of these initiatives, many of them are fundamentally kind of focused on the very serious, very important, particular challenges facing cobalt production in DRC. And a lot of the important environmental issues, economic justice issues that are dominating this discourse in Latin America don't really fit into very well to the way in which these things have been defined and developed. And so I think there's an opportunity for a stronger voice for Latin American activists in some of these global dialogues. I'm just going to skip to the last point here, and then I'll leave it from there, which is, so overall, I've shared a lot of things. This is what I would say are the key takeaways that I would encourage, that your feedback would be valuable, and that I would encourage you to think about as your work on this continues to evolve. One, and I'm just going to read them. I know Margarita will tell me this is bad training practice, but I'm going to read them just so that they can stick in your mind. One, the market structures for critical minerals create several specific challenges to effective governance in the producer countries, and that a detailed assessment of the market for each mineral is essential. I've generalized a lot today, but in setting policy and governance priorities, it's important to actually dive into the specifics of different mineral markets. We're starting to do that with some research that we're doing now in NRGI, but we want to continue to work with all of you as we think about, okay, what is particular, not even just to lithium, but to this type of lithium, right? Or what is particular to this other mineral, and how does the country need to think about that as it sets a sustainability agenda? Second, the growing consumer interest in making clean batteries clean can help generate leverage for reform to increase sustainability. So take advantage of this international drive as a way to continue to get support for and to drive the reform agenda in the places that you're all working. And then third, the point that I made just at the end here, civil society groups from the region can help fill gaps in the inclusiveness and the content of leading battery sustainability initiatives. There should be an S there, sorry. I think there's a greater leadership role that all of you on this call can continue to play in making these international initiatives more effective and more relevant to what you're seeing in the countries where you're working. So I will stop there and turn it back over to Margarita, and looking forward to the feedback from the discussants. Thank you.
Thanks for, just, I was about to say we should be wrapping up and you just did. So that's fantastic. So now I'm gonna first give the floor to Emily. But first I wanted to flag that it would be great if you can start sharing any questions you might have on the using both or either the Q&A box or the chat. We already have a couple of questions for Patrick. So yeah, those are questions that all of us are seeing, so it might also structure the conversation from now on. So Emily Hirsch, you're to
all right. Hi everybody. So there's a guy cutting the lawn next door, so I apologize in advance if it's terrible and you need me to repeat what I'm saying. Just let me know. Y'all, I'm going to share my screen for just while I'm talking, just to have something in the background. I've got a real short, not even a actual presentation. It's just while Patrick was talking, I pulled together a few kind of background slides to talk about. So I wanted to first of all kind of just let everybody know that it's Thanksgiving tomorrow in the United States, and I am spending the day taking care of my niece and nephew who are 4 and 6, and it is my job to keep them occupied for a few days. So I decided to make some piñatas, which if anyone's ever made piñatas, it has a very straightforward supply chain, if you will, where you got to make a balloon, you got to cover it up with glue and paper, you can decorate it. It then has to sit around for about 2 or 3 days. Then you pop the balloon, you fill it up with candy, you can paint it or whatever, and then you can smash it. But right now, my niece and nephew are a little bit mad at me for 2 reasons. One, they are upset with me that they will not be able to make perfect unicorns and deer the first time we make balloon piñatas. And the second thing they're very upset with me with is that it's going to need to sit for 48 to 72 hours before we can smash it. And they're blaming me. And it reminds me a little bit about my constant conversations that I've had over the past 5 years working. I've been living in Latin America for the last 11 years, but specifically the last 5 to 7 years when I've tried to talk to policymakers and government officials about this idea that a country with a lithium deposit should be making batteries. Because the same way that my niece and nephew are mad at Emily that glue has to dry, these countries sometimes seem upset with Emily that they can't just snap their fingers and have a battery supply chain overnight. And so I wanted to kind of just explain why it's not Aunt Emily's fault that Bolivia is not going to be making batteries, that Peru is not going to be making batteries, that Argentina is not going to be making batteries, but that doesn't make them failures. And in fact, you can't make that deer piñata if you don't make a couple balloon-shaped ones first. So this is just a little overview of the 6 specific, I'm not going to call them steps to make the lithium battery, I'm going to call them industries. Each of these squares represents an entire industry with its entire own supply chains, its entire own levels of expertise, and its entire own set of inputs and preconditions that countries have to be able to do before they can even talk about the policies to do them. I've got a paper on this. If anyone wants it, I can send it over, but I'm going to try to keep this a little bit light on the ground in the interest of getting the discussion moving. Second thing to understand is that most of a battery is not made of lithium. So this is a little overview of what's in a cathode. The cathode is the positive side of the battery. The lithium cell CE is a lithium carbonate equivalent. So this is a lithium bearing compound that has to be mixed with all of these other chemicals and additives. And then if you put it into the battery, that cathode is about 22%. So you can kind of safely say that in your final battery, lithium is going to represent somewhere between 3 and 10% of that final battery cost, depending on the relative prices that are going on around it. But I think everyone can kind of agree that just having a lithium deposit is kind of like having a field of wheat. You need that field of wheat to make a wedding cake, but you aren't necessarily going to create a wedding cake shop at your wheat field. this is another little overview. This is Volkswagen's supply chain, but you can kind of see that you have to pull the minerals out. This is the same for everything, including lithium. You have to produce chemicals. So kind of like Patrick said when he talked about a major and a minor mineral, an important distinction between those two minerals is that a minor mineral needs advanced processing to have a value. And that advanced processing step is differentiated between the different players in the supply chain, and it is not a copy-paste from some other existing industry. So just like you have to learn how to make a balloon before you can make a deer, if a country wants to be making these advanced chemicals and adding value locally, they need to start making these chemicals and learn how to do it. Oh, good. More noise. This is one of the slides that I really think is important to understand the lithium market and to understand the lithium market from the South American perspective. Chile and Argentina are already both important players in the lithium supply chain. I'll wait till this catastrophe resolves itself. Let's look at these circles. So one of the reasons that there's a lot of interest in the lithium supply chain is kind of along with what Patrick was saying, that the market is growing at an exponential rate to meet the demand for lithium-ion batteries. And this is the market relative size. And when you look at that as an investor, you look at that as a country, you're like, wow, that's growing really fast. I need to be part of this. And it's important, though, to understand that this little dot was only worth $1 billion. So 2015 was the first year that the entire global lithium market passed $1 billion. To give that a little context, this is the lithium market on top of the gold market. And this is the lithium and the gold market on top of the oil market. So while that growth looks very important, and it is very important, the biggest challenge to the lithium industry is financing. It is not easy to finance a lithium project. It is not easy to find partners with expertise. I'm sorry, guys. Like, trust me, it's better than the babies that are mad at me. It's important to understand that the biggest challenge to building lithium supply chains currently and still is lack of financing and finding companies willing to write $500 million checks to build new lithium projects, especially in Latin America, especially in today's environment when we're seeing political uncertainty kick up in Latin America, especially when we're seeing policymakers in Latin America demonstrate willingness to change and lack of understanding of just how complicated this industry is. So to kind of close out my talk before something else catastrophic befalls my situation, I wanted to kind of take away from Patrick's talk that I think that his conclusion that we don't need more initiatives. The initiatives need to work together. I want to add on to that the initiatives need to work harder to learn what the battery supply chain looks like from the ground up, because this isn't, but to Patrick's comment where he only found 2 lithium contracts, yeah, there's only 4 or 5 major lithium players. There's only 4 or 5 major lithium projects in the world. And so if Latin America wants to be part of the lithium story, Latin America needs to take a leadership role, which means you can't do analysis from behind a desk in Washington, D.C., because the analyses that you need to read to understand this market haven't been written. And that's what makes it exciting. That's what makes it an opportunity, but that's also what makes it a little bit more difficult and a little bit more challenging. Latin America needs to focus on building these industries. And I'd like to kind of finish off by saying it's interesting that Bolivia has built over the last 2 decades an entire industry around talking about lithium without actually producing anything meaningful for the supply chain. Whereas 20 years ago, China started building the battery industry, and they've become the center of the world for the battery industry. And so I'd like to just encourage everybody to, when talking about lithium especially, but also these other minor minerals, keep it in your mind that these markets look like this. And getting capital, especially getting responsible capital, and getting capital that's going to stick and going to go through the essentially the trial and error version of making the balloon to making the piñata that looks like a deer, those players need political stability, and those projects are going to need in the billions of dollars per project. So that's my take on it. I'm going to turn the floor over to to my colleagues, and I'm willing to have conversations and do any questions that anybody is interested in.
Now a few questions are already popping up, so that's great. Thank you very much. As we said, you can both share your questions in Spanish or English, whatever is easier. But now we will have Victor react to this first interventions, and then we can go directly to answer some of the questions. Thanks, Victor.
Okay, thank you very much, Margarita, Juan Luis, and all the NRGI team for inviting me to be here today. I join my colleagues in this interesting discussion. Patrick is not struggling with his English. I hope I won't. So let's see how it works. So my first reaction when I received this invitation was, well, the title of this webinar is Governance Implications, and governance is a very broad concept. So my idea is just to go for some topics that I think are important to keep in mind, and the implications for the Andean region, which in my understanding is the key public audience who are attending this webinar. And I just want to raise some questions. Maybe we won't have all the answers. As Patrick said, this is an ongoing discussion. So yes, let's see what happens in the coming years, because it is a very quickly evolutionary situation. So yes, I would like to start saying that yes, we are talking about these electric vehicles because the transport is really important for decarbonization, yes, but also I would highlight that it is not only for decarbonization, but also for the control of the pollution, which is also another effect that is really important to address. And yes, the lithium-ion battery is a family of batteries, as Patrick said, and I was really happy seeing that chemical names in his presentation, because it is important to keep in mind that it has different properties, each compound, and this battery has replaced other form of batteries due to its capabilities and because it can run and power a car, which is what at the end of the day is looking for, because the idea is to replace the oil or diesel or gasoline for this other purpose. But we already have experience and expertise with batteries. We have the lead acid battery, which is the common one, which everyone can find in a car or other applications. And yes, the landscape is really challenging because for one side there's rapid technology changes. On the other hand, there's a lot of expectations around these clean energy minerals because it will be highly mineral intense. And you know, this famous World Bank initiative, Climate Smart Mining, they tell us on their different scenarios how the quantity of minerals will be needed just to move into the greener technologies, and the amounts are pretty huge. So you can easily find the actual demand multiplied by 20 times or something like that, which is really huge. And I would like also to highlight that we are not talking just about lithium and cobalt, but there are also other minerals that are really important for that transition. For example, nickel, and for example, graphite. And keep in mind that graphite is carbon. Yes, is one of the two mineralogical forms of carbon. The other is diamond. So it is really exciting to see how the Mother Earth gives us these challenges on the floor. And yes, I entirely agree with Emily when she highlights the necessity of give a proper floor for the investment, because without stability and without proper conditions, the investment won't take place. So the question is how to properly benefit from those mineral rents that are expected, and this is the classical governance issue. Also, we have to think in progressive and fair tax systems and so on. So let's see how the government responds against that. So I would like also to highlight that electric vehicles still being pretty expensive goods. Yes. As Patrick told us, showed a really cool map, and you could focus and see that all the electric vehicles facilities and bans are concentrated in rich countries. So I made a personal exercise here in Chile, where I live, and an electric car is more or less 2.5 times more expensive than other car, combustion car with similar characteristics. So it is also important to keep in mind that yes, it's still being, it is for one side needed for these decarbonization goals, but on the other hand, you have to keep in mind that it is still expensive. And also because the battery has a significant part of the car cost into its cost structure. So the question and the expectation is to see how fast will fall the cost. You can find some information in many sources about how quickly are dropping down the cost for the electric vehicles. And let's see how far it materializes, because today it will be and still difficult to a normal person to prefer an electric vehicle over a normal one, more or less in countries like ours, which we are not rich countries and we won't have the possibility to offer subsidies like other rich countries does, like the US or tax credit offers tax credit, or other societies like the Netherlands, Norway, Germany. So let's see how it develops. And yes, the first question I would like to raise is that, is how to allocate properly and efficiently public funds in decarbonization initiatives. And the other question is there a significant market for these electric vehicles for now, outside Europe, outside North America, and outside some rich countries in Asia? This is an open question, and see how fast the market develops. Other thing as I would like to highlight is the technological challenges are really huge, and of course there are many things or many perspectives you can have around that. We are talking about to make better batteries, so to increase their performance, but also we're talking about looking for new technologies. So the replacement risk is a fact, and as Patrick told us, many battery makers are looking at a solution for cobalt, for example. So it is a real possibility to replace some components of the battery. Let's see how fast this research goes. But it is also important for the host countries to keep in mind that today the market seems pretty big and promising, but it depends on how the technology evolves. Also, there's another risk, and this is about recycling. As Patrick tells us, there's a lot of concern on how to recycle these electric batteries, because it is not clear that all the battery can be recycled, and this is the same concerns and questions around the other green technologies. So you can see, for example, for solar panels, that there's a lot of concern and questions on how to recycle it, and it's the case also for the wind turbines. So it is also a field for research, a field for people who is interested in working with that, make an apport. Yes, and Patrick already known us this very interesting alliances that were built in order to address these governance issues around the value chain. I just can name the Global Battery Alliance. This is in my opinion, the biggest one or the most famous. We are talking of more than 40 enterprises that are working in that field. So it is very interesting to see how this evolves. And there's an idea about a battery passport related with that responsible sourcing, but also for recycling, circular economy, and all those new concepts that all these guys are talking about. So it is an interesting one, and if any of you are interested, please go there and check what are they saying. Also, the London Metal Exchange has a lithium and electric vehicle battery materials initiative, and it was to address one of the most problematic issues in lithium market, which is pricing. As Patrick said to us, yes, this is a big concern because it is not the classical metals market. It is another thing. And today, what you can see is that there are several qualities. For that, it is really hard to set a spot price. But it is trying to develop. So let's see what the London Metal Exchange offers to the market. And there comes another question, and is given this international interest, how can the governments and business work together to promote efficient public policies and research and development projects? I think the technology is a key player, and yes, let's see how it works and where. And now, talking about the role of the Andean region in the value chain, we are mostly suppliers of the commodities because the capabilities to manufacture and construction of the batteries are places outside. However, the beginning of the value chain is really important, of course, and today we are facing, as a region, and the industry is facing, a growing responsible production needs and concerns, and the clients are often looking and pretty aware of where the resources coming from and how are they produced. Topics like the use of water, the human rights, and so on are really important, and it is a real movement in the developed world to see how these materials and batteries are made. You can expect that at least in the European Union, the standards for the human rights will evolve, will be more strict. So let's see how it evolves. And some other stakeholders expressed their concerns about the environmental impacts of lithium extraction in dry zones, like the Atacama Desert here in northern Chile. You can find many press releases trying to say that situation. The internet is full of useful material about that. So maybe later I can give you some links, some useful links for those who are interested. For the cobalt side, Patrick already told us what's the situation. And there are other minerals, for example, nickel, which is also exploited in the region. So let's see how it happens there. But a fact is clear that the consumers are increasingly worried about the standards that are made or how the products they consume are produced. So here's the classical governance issue. So it is regarding the how to coordinate the stakeholders, and it still has no clear answer. But it is an interesting question to see how this develops, because here in the region there's growing concerns about the production, and the companies are responding to that. You can see those portals at the internet where you can see some details about the production, for example, of SQM, is the lithium and other minerals producer here in northern Chile. So, and well, and I would like to highlight also that this There are other materials, but there are many countries that are increasingly interested in to see how the possibilities for they are in this new market. As we said, the market perspectives are really, really high. And of course, it creates an interest on many other countries, like, for example, Brazil, like, for example, Mexico or Peru, are looking to develop new mines on lithium particularly, but also in other minerals that are important for the energy transition and for the batteries. The market is quite sensitive. You can remember, for example, when Mr. Elon Musk said the statement of self-produced lithium in Nevada, and the markets were really, really nervous. But then they came to the reality that to produce lithium is a complex process, and it would take time for Tesla to develop the facilities. Or even the fact that when Mr. Musk already said that he's offering a big contract for nickel producers, and many people in the industry were saying, well, where will we find this clean and green nickel, because it was hard to find. So there's more governance issues around them. And there's another question, and is how to attract the quality investments, because you have to agree in fair terms of taxation, manage the rent properly, and in a transparent way. And of course, try to guarantee the environmental care. And all of this you have to do all at the same time. So the challenge is not easy for the host countries. And of course, the civil society organizations have a lot to do and to campaign, of course, backing up these international trends, but also keeping in mind the local situations. And of course, and finally, I would like to highlight the thing is, yes, there's a question around how to make complex the value chain and try to develop some value added here in the region. Emily already said to us that it will be really difficult, and it is, in fact. But at least here in Chile, there's an attempt to do that. It was here a public auction in 2017 or 18, I don't remember the year, to try to establish a Center for Clean Technologies here in the country. And now the process is open, and is expected an answer from the regulator in the coming months. So the question is valid, and yes, everyone is thinking around how to make complex economies here in the region, more diversified economies, and the fact is clear that the facilities for the processing is still located in the developed world. So what would be the role of the countries here in the Andean region to try to join in a proper manner in this global value chain? So I would keep my comment here. And yes, thank you very much for the invitation, and of course open for the discussion.
So we have, I mean, there's a whole conversation going on. We are using all the Zoom features here, the Q&A, the chat, and while we're transmitting also the live conversation. So have a look at the chat and what's been going on there, because it's interesting to keep an eye on the questions and answers that have been taking place. I do think we have several questions, and it's already 8 minutes. We might run a bit over the time, and perhaps if any of you want to stay, you can stick. If you want, you can leave. But basically, there's a kind of, I would say, more general question, and I will throw it and for Patrick, Emily, or Victor to chime in if you want. There's a question: we transfer lessons and models from international extractive industry governance mechanisms to electric vehicle battery governance. And I think this is something that was addressed by Patrick at some point, but it might be interesting to have a quick thought about that. Should we focus on initiatives, on outputs, should we focus, initiatives on outputs products like electric vehicles or on specific minerals and metals? And there's also a question around whether NRGI will be focusing on other green, clean energy outputs. There's one that would be a big question, I would say. And then we have a couple others. There's a question about East Africa, well, in Tanzania, where they have vast natural and gas, started applying it into vehicle as a source of fuel. So there are a bit of natural gas, comparing it with petrol and gas in electric vehicles and the green environment. These are both kind of connected. So just wanted to put those on the table, and again, keep an eye on the chat because conversations are also taking place there. Also, I mean, just to say that we're all seeing what questions are popping up, so if you feel like answering to others or connecting them, just go ahead. Perhaps we can start by giving forward. It's fine.
Yeah, and it's amazing to see, Emily, you are so much more of a wizard than I am at responding to the chat in real time. I can't walk and chew gum at the same time. But to share a couple of reflections on the points you raised, Margarita, from the great questions, on the lessons of kind of extractives governance as we have done it up till now and how we kind of apply it in this space. I think my sense is that there's elements that are the same and elements that are different. And at the parts where I think our toolkit can really serve us well is fundamentally, I think a lot of the priorities for governing, electric vehicle materials right are core elements of the toolkit that we've been developing and pushing collectively over the years, right? Transparency, accountability, checks and balances, guidance against corruption, detailed economic and market analysis so as to make the right decisions about how to exercise leverage, etc. So I think that we don't need to think of this as we're starting over when it comes to extractives governance. I think the big difference, and I think it's an opportunity and a challenge, is for at least some of these materials, the linkage between kind of consumer-facing pressures and what's moving down at the bottom of the supply chain is tighter, right? And there is an opportunity, I think, to exercise some of what we're getting in terms of pressure from consumers on, okay, how sustainable is the production of these materials, in a way that can be applied back to, okay, what's happening down the chain somewhat more directly. It's not perfectly seamless, but somewhat more directly than has been the case for oil or tin or iron. And so I think that we as a sort of extractives industry governance movement need to get a little bit smarter about thinking about that consumer-producer nexus than I think we have traditionally done in the past. So there are challenges and there are opportunities there. For me, it connects a little bit to Kendra's second question, which you also raised, which is, so are we thinking in NRGI about kind of campaigns or work around not just electric vehicles, but about wind turbines and other clean energy materials? And my answer is, I think that we should all leverage the important focus on and the push for an increase in production of the material foundations of the clean energy revolution. We should all leverage that as a way to make sure that there is sufficient attention being paid to governance as a part not just of serving the needs of the people in the producer countries, but also maintaining stability in the supply chain. And so I think that to some extent, we should leverage the interest and the real drive for an increase in the production of these materials. The part that is trickier for some of those other inputs, aluminum, for example, is when you start to get into what is a major metal, then the governance and the particular economic nature of that mineral market might not look too different from what it's looked like before, even if there is a projected increase in demand. And so that kind of comes back to one of the points that I raised earlier, which is I think we need to become more sophisticated in the way that we are looking around governance of specific mineral and metals markets rather than just trying to apply a general or generic toolkit across the board.
You have my apologies. I've run around yelling that the industry needs a checkbook, not a guidebook. But to kind of show the positive sides of some of these best practices conversations and some things that can be learned from other industries, I think that good governance toolkits and a lot of the tools that the NRGI has developed are a really strong place to start a conversation and to start a conversation between communities, between industry, and between government. And then from that beginning of the conversation, each specific situation will develop the way that it's going to develop. The tools that the good governance tools are not a checklist, but they're the points at which different people who have different incentives and different backgrounds and different goals are going to be able to begin to come together to build something together. When I was in Canada in February, I talked to a company who I knew had a little trouble with their community or the community that they're trying to work around. And they gave me a 10-minute lecture about how it was just two guys and just two guys and just two guys. And I asked them, what are those guys' names? And they said, well, we don't know. And I said, well, maybe that's why they don't like you. And it's a joke, but some of the tools for governance and the tools that the NRGI is developing are geared towards helping different players and different stakeholders understand better where the other ones are coming from and begin to build a sort of a strong foundation. Because, as I think that more and more people are understanding when it comes to mining versus something like oil and gas, when you go in and start an exploration project for a critical mineral or for even any of your traditional minerals, you're talking about, best case scenario, 7 years before you even begin to construct a mine. And then at the end of that 7 years, you're talking about 3 or 4 to build it. And then you're talking about production over 30, 35 years. So realistically, these mining projects have a 50 to 70 year lifespan. And so you're building a relationship that is going to need to have the ability to be flexible and change over time. And so I think when looking at how to apply best practices and how to learn from other industries, these are all tools to start a conversation and develop a strong relationship that's capable of supporting a project over time.
Well, thank you very much. Just a few comments. Well, I strongly agree with Emily. Yes, you have to keep in mind that mining is a long-term business. So you will be a neighbor of a community for many, many years. So it's better to live with a good neighbor that rather than other you have problems every day. So, but it is known from maybe the last 30 years, it is still problematic. So I would like to add that the manage of expectation is also important, because as we said, there is expected a huge increasing on the demand side. So it generates a lot of expectations. And maybe some, not only communities, but stakeholders are interested in, of course, see how they benefit from this new demand scenario. And I think it is normal, but it is very important to keep in mind and to have an open and transparent discussion, and to see that, yes, on one side you have to attract the investment, on the other be aware on how the minerals are produced, and keep a balance, because it is very important for the nation, for the countries, to have the rent, because there are needs on health, on education, and so on, and it must be fulfilled. So, and there's a question from a colleague in Africa about the gas cars. I don't have an answer of that, but you can check the Colombian experience on that, because it was a transition that started maybe 20 years ago, when, because of the prices, the natural gas was used as a fuel on cars. And I don't know how it impacted in, for example, pollution or environment, but it was a really, really huge amount of cars that were transformed into this other source of fuel. So maybe you can check that experience. Yes, because here in the region, in the north side of South America, as you know, we have hydrocarbons deposits. And Colombia has a lot of gas, so it was useful for the country to exploit that and to give the gas for the transport sector.
Thanks, everyone. My connection is a bit unstable, as you could already see. So if I'm fine, then I'll close. If not, Juan Luis will. We have a lot of questions that were popping up as we were talking, so perhaps we will share those with you, and we can find ways to share some answers with participants. They are also asking for some of the material that was mentioned at different points during this session, so it would be great if we can find a way to share those with them. Well, I just wanted to say thank you very much to all of you. I think it was a great session, a lot of discussion, a lot of other things to continue talking about, but it's already 5 minutes. We're 5 minutes past our time. So I don't know, Juan Luis, if you'd like to close this, invite people for the next.
Thank you, Margarita. And thank you, Patrick, Emily, Victor Andres, for these great contributions on this topic, and to everyone who managed to attend, for their questions, their feedback on the chat, and just for being here. I think this is a conversation that we haven't finished in this hour and a half. This to be continued, of course. I would like to say that this is going to be uploaded to the website and to our YouTube channel as well. We'll make sure to put subtitles in Spanish for those who are unable to understand English, or rather see the subtitles in Spanish. It's better for them. I would also like to say that next year we'll have a session specifically on lithium in Chile and Bolivia, to see how these dynamics are playing on the ground in these two countries. So this is to be continued, and we'll keep in touch. And thank you very much to all the persons who attended all this series, and we'll see you soon. Thanks. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.